My name is Yanula Thanasakis, and I'm co-founder of the Environmental Humanities series, and it's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you this evening and introduce our panelists who are so kindly giving up their precious time for what will be a fantastic evening. I first would like to thank the Environmental Studies Department in its entirety, the Animal Studies Initiative, and the Center for the Humanities, and both its directors and staff. I would like to thank our panelists for coming again, and our audience members as well. So the point of the environmental humanities is to bring together voices from the sciences, the quote-unquote hard and soft sciences and the humanities, to come into conversation with one another. And often in the humanities, which is my own background, we have a tendency to overshoot with our titles, our talks, our promises. So I'm going to share two talk titles that may or may not be former titles of my own. How the Arts Can Save the World, and Radical Teaching and a Better Planet. Now, I bring that up because tonight's panel title, Captured at Sea, Trafficking, Slavery, and Illegal Fishing on the Open Ocean, I feel actually under-delivers, because the people on this panel should be wearing capes, both on the poster and tonight up on stage. That's including our moderator, Jennifer Jacquet. So we are so pleased that you're here. We're so excited for the linkages between different disciplines to become clearer and stronger. And I'm very much looking forward to listening to tonight's panel. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Thank you, Yanula. So I wish that I had John Hocevar's Halloween costume up here instead of just his head, but he sent me the photo too last minute. And I again want to thank the speakers again for volunteering their time to come be with us tonight. And thank you all for joining in what will likely be a difficult topic, but one that's very worthy of our attention: the issue of slave labor and the problem of overfishing. So as most of you know, globalization has created an interconnected world, and we all benefit from many aspects of that, but it's also created a regulatory vacuum. And it's now possible that retailers sell, and we regularly purchase, unknowingly, marine life like tuna and shrimps that may have been caught illegally or processed or caught by slave labor. So I think the question, one of the most pressing questions in the 21st century, is how we extend our expectations for a better planet, but more specifically for this case, for best fishing practices and labor standards through global supply chains. And there are very different opinions about how this should be done. So in 2014, The Guardian ran this article about trafficked and human slavery in Thai trawlers for shrimp. And in response, David Cameron, the prime minister at the time, said that, and here's the subtitle, "It's up to consumers whether they eat prawns processed in Thailand using slave labor." So this is among one of the many issues we're planning to tackle tonight on responsibility in the global supply chain. Does it belong to consumers like Taylor Swift eating prawns in Tokyo, or does it belong to producers, or does it belong to governments? So tonight we plan to talk about why slave labor is used in the fishing industry, the effort to expose it, who's responsible for it, and what we can do about it. And we'll hear about how environmental and social problems are inextricably linked. We're so fortunate to be joined by such experts on the subject, and I just briefly want to go through their biographies before they take the stage. So Daniel Pauly will speak first. He is the best known fisheries biologist in the world. I don't say that lightly. And he works truly globally, running the Sea Around Us project, which is a global database about the world's fish catches, subsidies, marine protected areas, and other things. He has lived and worked everywhere. He really is a global citizen, but he is here with us at NYU this semester as a visiting distinguished professor, and he is otherwise a Killam University professor at the University of British Columbia. He was also, full disclosure, my PhD supervisor. Ian Urbina is a reporter for the New York Times, and he wrote the incredible series that came out last year on the outlaw ocean in the Times. He now has a book of the same title forthcoming and a film as well, and that will all happen in the near future. And he heads back to sea and will continue reporting in January, starting in January 2017 for the full calendar year. So this is someone who is not afraid to truly muckrake in the bottom of the ocean. Abby McGill is the campaigns director for the International Labor Rights Forum, which is a policy advocacy organization fighting to end child labor, forced labor, and discrimination, and promoting workers' rights to organize and secure safe and decent working conditions. She's responsible for coordinating campaigns around labor exploitation in globally traded food commodities, including seafood from Thailand, and I think that's a topic on which they've been incredibly active, her group, and we'll hear more about their campaign specifically tonight. Finally, John Hocevar has helped win several major victories for marine conservation since becoming the director of Greenpeace's ocean campaigns in 2004. He has worked on Menhaden in Chesapeake Bay, the pollock fishery in Alaska, the BP Deep Horizon spill in the Gulf, and as shallow as coral reefs and as deep as the canyons in the Bering Strait. Greenpeace has also been really active on this particular issue, and we'll get into some of their work again tonight. So the lineup for the evening is as follows. Daniel Pauly will speak, then Ian Urbina will speak, and then we're going to show a trailer for a new film called Ghost Fleet, and it's directed by Shannon Service, and tonight we also have in the audience John Bowermaster, who's the producer of the film, and Sherry Sant Plummer, who is the executive producer, as well as an NYU alum. So you can do great things when you graduate from NYU. Then Abby McGill will speak, then John Hocevar, and then we'll open up the floor to Q&A and have a few questions on the panel as well. So thank you again all for being here, and I'll start it off with Daniel Pauly.
I have been given the lousy job of having to contextualize, to present the context from which you will move up. It is going to be boring. The first thing is that it's rather trivial. The fishing industry has to reduce costs because fishing costs money, and the returns past a certain level of fishing start to diminish, and because the catch itself diminishes. So at first you make good money. You see the difference between the straight line, the cost line, and the return line is big, but after a while it becomes narrower and narrower. At some point, the fishery can just get its cost back in. So at this point, something must be done. The fisheries in the world manage to continue by reducing cost, and there are different ways of reducing cost. One is perfectly legitimate, is improving the technology. Improving technology is about 2% per year on the average. If you introduce GPS or acoustics methods for identifying the fish, or better navigation, or winches as opposed to people pulling up nets, you improve the technology rapidly. It moves vertically. But if you average over the whole fleet about 2% per year, and that can go over 100 years. So if you took a trawler that operated in 1880, when steam trawlers were introduced, a trawler of the same size with the same power would fish 20 times more and better than it did then. So that is the technological improvement or technological creep. Another way of reducing the cost line is subsidies. Subsidies are essentially transfers of money from one part of the economy to another. And governments do this in lots of countries. They fund fleets that are too big. To maintain themselves, they overfish this fleet, and then they find that they have to go fish somewhere else with bigger costs of fuel and others, and they end up in this vicious circles of subsidies, more and more subsidies. Subsidies are very widespread in Asia and in Europe. a bit less in the US, and they are different kinds. They are the good kind, subsidies that for research, I'm a researcher, and subsidy for safety at sea. That is a good thing. The Coast Guard, management, and all of these are good subsidies. But bad subsidies are everything that allows fishers to increase their fishing power at the cost of other parts of the economy, because they get, for example, subsidized loans. And a subsidized loan can enable you to buy a boat that cannot be supported by the resources that are around. For example, in New England right now, you have vessels that should not be entering the fleet, but do. In Europe, lots of subsidies are used for renewing the fleet. So the fishers get decommissioning subsidies for retiring their boat, and they use the decommissioning money to buy a new boat. That is a big problem. Another form of reducing costs is not the one that you think, that you don't paint the boats anymore. It is illegal fishing. What do you save with illegal fishing? And I'm not talking about paying the crew, I'm talking about not paying license fees, not paying access fees. Since the law of the sea is the law of the land, so to say, only the US has not ratified the law of the sea, but respect it anyway. The law of the sea makes it possible for countries to get paid if a foreign fleet operates in its waters. And illegal fishing is fishing without permission in these waters. And it is very widespread, and perhaps 1/4, perhaps 20% of the world catch is caught illegally. Finally, and this, remember this serves as introduction to this presentation, to the presentation here. Finally, we have the crew. Now, traditionally, the division of the benefits from a boat is about 50% to the captain and the boat owner, and then 20% to the captain and the crew, 50% for the boat owner, 20% for the captain, and the other part is for the crew. That is traditionally so since the Middle Ages. This has changed, and on most boats you have, everybody is an employee. You don't have often, only in a few countries like Denmark, you have owner-operated vessel, but in most countries everybody is an employee. And if you look at how much the men get, or fishers get in for working on commercial vessels in the US, this is about $14 per hour, $13 to $14 per hour, and it is the same everywhere in various US states. And that's because there is an alternative, mostly for work on land, that is approximately paying that much. It's similar to the minimum wage in lots of situations, in lots of parts of the US now. And then there is slavery. There is the classical slavery that we read about of the antique time, and there is a slavery that you had in this country, antebellum. Now, this slavery was different from the one we have now. We talk about human trafficking, not anymore, but slave transport and stuff across the Atlantic. It involves people working against their will, and working outside of contract that are freely engaging. And we have here people who know about it, and notably Ian, who has documented various aspects of this slavery, and here is an article that he wrote about Obama closing a loophole that you will certainly hear about, a loophole that in the law that enabled slavery-like condition to prevail in a US fishery in Hawaii. So I think that is all, and the next.
So my name's Ian Urbina. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. In my allotted 8 minutes, I'm going to try to sort of sprint through two things. One is just an overview of the series that we ran and that's ongoing called The Outlaw Ocean. And the second is to sort of focus on the one of the 8 stories that have run so far, the one story that most specifically was on human slavery. This is going to be a little distracting because this is a slideshow of footage from all 8 stories. But if you get bored with me joining on, watch that. So the series began about 2 years ago. It was called The Outlaw Ocean, and it had a simple thought as its impetus, which was, 2/3 the planet is covered by water, and much of that space is ungoverned and ungovernable in many ways. And let's go out there, let's take the reader, and let's do a couple things. One, let's focus on the diversity of crime that happens out there. So let's, we know about the BP spill, we know about sort of Captain Phillips Somali style piracy, but there's a lot of other criminality out there, and we thought it would be a public service to go investigate it. In the end, the 8 stories thus far, touched on human slavery, arms trafficking, intentional dumping, murder of stowaways, and a range of other crimes. The other methodological sort of goal of the series was to the extent that there was reporting ongoing, great reporting, The Guardian in particular, AP, others, and then folks on this panel churning out reporting. But one thing we wanted to do that sought to be different was get out on the vessels as much as possible and report as much directly on site as opposed to from interviews with returning deckhands. So those were the sort of goals. The story in particular that most pertains to this panel was one that was focused on the South China Sea. It was long and has been known for a while, well known that there's a real human slavery problem offshore. And that while it occurs in many places, go to New Zealand, Falkland Islands, off the coast of Africa, there are lots of places where you can find these really acute cases. The South China Sea was a distinct and illustrious place to explore the topic because of the size of its fleet and the complexity and sort of durability of the problem there, and the Western dependence on what came out of there. So a photographer and I went there with the goal of simply reporting it out. And in particular, we wanted to get on a certain subsection of ship, which were the transshipment vessels. And this, as Professor Pauly explained better than I ever can, there's sort of an intersection between the labor and the environmental story in the form of overfishing has led to a depletion of fish stocks near shore. And so ships are having to go much further away from shore to break even. And at some point, they get so far away from shore that the economics don't make sense. The fuel is too expensive, the expenses are too high, and so transshipment emerged, which is a system in which the ships stay out there. And often they're 250 in the South China Sea, 250, 300 miles offshore or further. And they just stay out there for very long periods, sometimes 2, 3, 4 years. And this subsection, and the fish come back by motherships that's transported, and then fuel, parts, food, ice, etc. are brought out by motherships. But the fishing vessels stay out there and just keep trawling or longlining. We wanted to get on those ships in particular because we'd heard from the likes of Abby and John and Professor Pauly and State Department and plenty of others, EJF, these organizations, that if you really wanted to witness and chronicle the acute human slavery stories, you need to get out onto those vessels. So that's essentially what we did. Adam Dean, the photographer, and I took some doing, but eventually we got out onto those ships. And one in particular, which I think we've already blitzed by, is the one we ended up focusing on. This was sort of a quintessential, kind of textbook case ship in the South China Sea. It was a Thai vessel. It was crewed by about 40 Cambodian deckhands, about 4 officers. The officers were Thai. The crew were Cambodian. When we first arrived, the captain said all the crew is 17 or older. And if I see, oh, there it is. There's the shot. So this is the ship. I was hoping I'd see this shot. So, when we got on this vessel, the captain said, all his crew were 17 or older. We spent some time there, talked with these guys, and turns out quite untrue. The two guys you can see to the left are 13 and 15, and they'd been on the vessel for over a year each. You also saw something really interesting and somewhat informative about human slavery and trafficking in general, and that trafficking often can be put on a spectrum. So at least in the South China Sea and offshore, you have on one end of the spectrum what could be called soft version of trafficking, which is debt bondage. And so these are, the scenario there is Cambodians are brought in illegally by a trafficker into Thailand, the men promise jobs in construction, the women promise jobs as domestics, house aides. Typically that's not where they're destined. The men are destined to ships, the women are destined to the sex industry. They're brought in, they have no money, they're indebted to the trafficker. The men get to the shore, get to the dock, and the trafficker sells the individuals, these guys, to the captain. So the captain pays the $400 it costs to bring one of these guys to him. Now that worker is essentially owned by the captain because he's got a debt. That's debt bondage, kind of standard model. The other extreme on the trafficking spectrum is Shanghai. And that's a scenario which we also chronicled, not on this ship, but another main individual in the story, where essentially you're kidnapped. And in Thailand, often how that plays out is, again, undocumented workers from Laos or Cambodia or Myanmar come into Thailand. They're in a border town. We were in Ranong in particular, and they are carousing at a karaoke bar, brothel, and next thing they know, they wake up again and they're on a ship. You've been shanghaied. And essentially that's a situation in which the brothel workers or someone at the bar is in cahoots with the labor brokers, and the labor brokers are in cahoots with the fishing industry, and someone's drugged your drink and now you're on the ship. And often they're told, well, yeah, you passed out, but you had run up a debt and now you're going to pay it back, and we're at sea already. And on these vessels, you see the whole spectrum of this sort of trafficking. So I didn't start the clock as I was supposed to. Oh, I did. So it's 8 minutes. So I'll just close down by saying, I think the point that Professor Pauly makes about the hidden costs, that's a really, in my view, smart, I wish I had talked with him earlier, way to view the intersection between the sort of blue-green divide, the environmental and the labor intersection as it plays out offshore. I do think that if you start assessing these as costs, these illegalities as costs, and quantifying them and forcing some of the very suppliers, the very sellers to account for those costs, you'll start to see a leveling out potentially of the market and also a better informed consumer public who is willing perhaps to pay the true price or a premium for better vetted seafood. Thanks.
As Jennifer mentioned at the beginning, we are an organization that works on global commodity supply chains. And in particular, I work with partners around the world, mostly labor unions and worker organizations that are trying to improve conditions in globally traded commodities. And the way that we do this is to work with our partners on finding solutions in three primary areas. Industry practices that are causing forced labor, child labor, and other egregious rights abuses, how we can hold those corporations accountable and change those practices. Laws and policies, so how we improve government regulation and enforcement in order to eliminate labor rights abuses. And worker empowerment, because the fact is that if you have an exploitable workforce, it likely will be exploited. So how do we bring together our workers to enforce their own rights on the ground in their workplaces? So I was asked today to talk about why the seafood sector is a human rights priority, so I'm going to just kind of give a quick overview using those 3 pillars as a lens from which to view this problem. I think that the reason that this is such an issue is that we tend in the United States to import most of our seafood now, 90% of it actually, and it's a gigantic, very profitable business. And, Thailand gets talked about a lot in this context, but I think it's important to note that in the last 3, at least, trafficking in persons reports annually released by the U.S. Department of State, there are more than 50 countries in the world that have been identified as having human trafficking somewhere in their seafood supply chain. So, a lot of the countries from which we are importing seafood have this problem. So, what are we supposed to do about it, and why does it continue to be such a problem? So the first thing we really look at is corporate accountability. Why are companies purchasing seafood that is produced with forced labor? I think that, something that has been talked about already is the issue of cost. So there is a big demand in this country and in many countries for cheap seafood. Shrimp used to be a very rare delicacy that we ate on occasion, and now, this guy who I love managed to get to 101 on the Red Lobster Endless Shrimp Buffet. He wrote an entire blog, actually, about how you can get the most of your money and shove as much shrimp into your face as possible while you're at Red Lobster. And so I think that, the question of do consumers have some responsibility in this? The answer is yes, and we are going to have to admit that the external costs that have been discussed here previously are going to have to be factored into our food purchases. But I don't think that we can put all of the blame on consumers. What we have right now is an economic model that's flipped, where the suppliers themselves, the people who are actually getting the fish and providing it to retailers, to seafood distributors, don't set the price, right? You have a few very large retailers, very large distributors at the top who are setting the price and saying that they will pay this much for shrimp, this much for scallops, this much for salmon. And that becomes the global market price that suppliers must be able to meet. I was at the Boston Seafood Expo, which is one of the largest seafood trading shows in the world this year. I had a panel there where 50 different industry heads came to talk about sustainability and how they can improve their supply chains. But when I went down to the trading floor, what I heard was, this guy can get it to me for $3. If you can't meet $3, then we're going with him. So I think we have to demand better food and demand to know where that food is coming from. And this is where things can get kind of complicated. The seafood supply chain is long and complex. The transshipment that Ian talked about makes it even longer and more complex. So what we're really telling companies that they have to do is they need to make public who they're sourcing from at each level of this supply chain, and let us know where the seafood is actually coming from so that we can trace it. This makes it a lot easier for our partners, where if we have a facility in Thailand that we know is keeping workers' documents and locking them in the facility, we can ultimately see where that product ends up and to whom we need to hold accountable for those practices. So that's a quick overview on corporate accountability. In terms of policies and laws, I think that it has been brought up today that one of the problems is the international nature of this supply chain. So I brought up our great friend Thai Union, who I'm sure John will talk about in his speech. It's one of the major seafood suppliers in the world. And this is just their production and distribution facilities. They don't even own fleets. So they're getting the seafood from so many different places, and it's going so many different places. And all of these places have very different standards of how workers should be treated, labor laws and how they're enforced. So I think that when we look at the problem, it's not a monolith of how do we help seafood workers. What we're actually talking about is how do we help seafood workers in each of these different legal contexts, which gets to be much, much more complicated. You know, in order to start hacking away at this problem, I think that one thing that really needs to happen is there needs to be an international understanding that seafood caught with forced labor and human trafficking is illegally caught seafood. Those crimes are illegal in every country in the world, but the common definition that we use right now for IUU, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, only looks at marine standards. It was developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization, International Plan of Action to Prevent, Deter, and Eliminate IUU Fishing, and it doesn't acknowledge that illegality in terms of how workers are treated is part of the problem. And, you know, there are a lot of initiatives happening right now in the United States with this presidential task force that I have an image up here with, in the EU in terms of seafood traceability for imports, and many, many, many different initiatives happening in producing countries that are trying to increase the traceability of seafood for environmental and sustainability purposes, but are refusing to acknowledge that labor and tracing how people get onto these boats and what happens to them once they get there is a question that needs to be answered. You know, the reason that question is so important is that the migrant labor issue that Ian brought up is a really, really salient one. You know, in Thailand, more than 90% of the entire seafood, that means I'm supposed to stop. More than 90% of you know, the workers in the seafood sector are from another country, and this is something that we see everywhere. So we need countries to improve their practices of recruiting migrant labor and overseeing how migrant labor is treated in order to really get a handle on this problem. And then the last piece, I'll go very quickly, is worker empowerment. These are our partners in Thailand, the Migrant Workers' Rights Network, that are trying to bring together groups of migrant workers to enforce their rights on the ground. This is a wildcat strike outside of a tuna cannery in Thailand. And I think that, you know, what this brings to my mind is that, you know, Martin Luther King said that riots are the language of the unheard. Right now, workers in this sector are completely unheard. They're isolated in very, very difficult to reach workplaces. One of the things that we're really trying to explore is how we can use some of the technology that Dr. Pauly was talking about to better trace where workers are going, how long they're staying at seas, and can we use these satellite technologies to also give workers access to Wi-Fi or cell phone technology when they're on the boats so that they can report when something has happened to them, but then to also put in place the structures to give them somebody to whom to complain, right? And to have some sort of worker-based verification model to ensure that they have somewhere to complain to. We have a lot more solutions. I'm barely scratching the surface on the website, so thank you all so much.
I always feel such a huge responsibility when I try to talk about this issue. I think about the people that we've met on boats and the stories that we've heard from colleagues, and thank you. In this case, I feel a little bit better because of the co-panelists and the pretty amazing clip of Ghost Fleet that we saw, so I'm feeling a little bit less pressure than normal. One of the things that I want to help you understand is why Greenpeace is talking about this at all. People generally still think of us as an environmental organization, and so I'll try to get to that a little bit. I'm going to focus on tuna fisheries, but this is a much more widespread problem than just tuna or just Thailand or any one fishery or location. But for context, the global tuna fisheries, 9 of 23 major stocks are overfished. There's a really serious problem with pirate fishing. It's a multi-billion-dollar problem. Although I would say that my view is that the biggest problems facing our oceans are currently legal. But part of how we first encountered a lot of the human rights abuses at sea were through our work on pirate fishing. We have 3 ships and we're operating pretty much year-round, and we would see things that were pretty bad and hard to understand, and we didn't really have the context, or some felt the mandate, to tackle it. But partly through the work of my fellow panelists and others, we started to see just how widespread this was, and also how interconnected it is with environmental issues. And of course, it's not just about tuna. So the tuna fisheries are massive in scale, and the impacts include devastating effects on populations of sea turtles, seabirds, sharks, but also on human beings. As we dug into the problem, we realized that at the highest level, they're inextricably linked. So we've eaten most of the big fish in the ocean, and that has made it a lot more expensive for fisheries to operate. It's more difficult for them to turn a profit. And so the unscrupulous operators look for ways to cut costs. They all look for ways to cut costs, but some of them do things like not pay workers a living wage or not give them decent working conditions. We talked to fishermen who had to eat bait to survive on some of these boats. And that, in turn, allows these operators to keep more boats on the water, which drives further overfishing. So it's not really even a cycle, it's more of a spiral. I heard a little bit about transshipment. It's an example of one of the ways where we realize some of the common problems and common solutions for environmental and social issues. Transshipment can result in fishermen stuck on boats for months or years at a time, like we saw. And it also adds to the huge problem that we already have of overcapacity, of too much fishing power, because boats don't have to go back to port. They don't have to stop fishing. They can just stay out. They hand fish over to another boat and they just keep fishing. Another common problem with the common solution is observer coverage. One of the largest fleets in the world is the Central Western Pacific longline tuna fleet, where a lot of our tuna comes from in the United States. And observer coverage is about 1% on these boats. So you imagine they're fishing hundreds of miles from shore, in many cases, out of sight, out of scrutiny. They can get away with a lot. Observer coverage is really important in helping address that. As we work to increase observer coverage and get closer to 100% than 1%, we also have to keep in mind that we need to figure out a way to protect these workers. This is Keith Davis, who disappeared at sea on a vessel in the South Atlantic last year. He was a friend of a friend, and he was very obviously murdered by people on the boat. There was a short investigation. There were no witnesses, no prosecution. No one was charged. That vessel is out there fishing now and supplying, in some cases, U.S. markets. Another example of how these issues are linked. Fishing industry is killing about 100 million sharks a year, tens of millions probably, certainly more than 10 million a year by the tuna fisheries. And one of the reasons is that it's part of the business model of the tuna industry. They don't pay workers a living wage in many cases, and so the fishermen on these boats fish in a way that they know is going to catch a lot of sharks. And they do that because then they're able to sell the fins of these sharks for extra money to supplement their income, kind of like tips for restaurant workers. So we have brands like Chicken of the Sea and Bumblebee saying, we don't allow shark finning in our supply chains, but fundamentally it's part of the business plan. We heard a little bit about Thai Union. Thai Union is a focus of a global Greenpeace campaign. So we have been putting pressure on them now for a couple of years. Happy to report it's actually starting to go pretty well. The company has made a lot of changes, and we're in, just between us, in negotiations now, and pretty optimistic that we'll get at least most of where we hope to fairly soon. So how do we try to move a multi-billion-dollar company with offices and brands and plants all over the world? Some of it is the kind of stuff that you'd probably expect from Greenpeace, banners. That's actually an airship. Even video games, art installations, billboards like this one that we put directly across from Chicken of the Sea's headquarters in San Diego, so they had to look at that every day for a while. And even mermaids after their brand. But I'd say the biggest leverage that we have is through their corporate relationships. And this is a scorecard that we first did in 2008, where we assessed supermarket chains in terms of the sustainability of their seafood. And unfortunately, even for us, all of them failed in 2008. We hoped that at least there'd be one good example that we could point to, but no such luck. But jump ahead a few years, and our 9th edition of this report came out last year, and 20 of the 25 retailers that we assessed actually made it into passing or even green grades. So we've seen the whole sector, the whole supermarket sector in this country shift. Meanwhile, other Greenpeace offices around the world have been doing similar things, so it's not like we're just fixing it here and the problem's getting moved somewhere else. So we've heard a lot about some pretty bad stuff. There are more people living in slavery today than any other time in human history. We've got a lot of overfishing, pirate fishing, habitat destruction. What's the good news? One of the most inspiring things that I can point to is that the big Asian fishing powers are really starting to change, and it's been impressive to see. First, Korea. I'd say 5 years ago would have definitely said that Korea was the biggest problem of pirate fishing in the world, and I wouldn't say that today. Taiwan has really started to make progress now, and I'd say 2 years from now we'll be able to say that they've made the kind of progress that Korea did over the past 5 years. This is a vessel that we boarded in the Pacific last year, and we found all kinds of violations. We found shark fins hidden in bags behind a door. They weren't supposed to be fishing in the region at all. They weren't licensed, a whole bunch of other things. So we shared that evidence with the Fisheries Agency of Taiwan, and they did nothing. They actually retroactively registered the vessel. That was their response. So that didn't really seem appropriate to us. We went and hung a banner on the Fisheries Agency's headquarters in Taipei. We did a press conference in front. It got a lot of bad attention for them, good attention for the issue in Taiwanese media. And since then, they've really turned it around in a lot of ways. Obviously a long way to go still, but pretty exciting. As you know from listening to this so far, this is no longer a secret. There's been some fantastic coverage of this issue, and that has made a huge difference. 2.5 years ago, this was not something that Walmart, Costco, even Whole Foods was talking to us about at all. And now, a story like Ian's comes out in the New York Times, Walmart calls us, Costco calls us. At least they say they want our help in figuring out what they can do, but they also want to assure us that they're doing everything they possibly can. But the main point is that this is something that is motivating to these companies. It's not motivating them fast enough or far enough yet, but they really don't want to have another story come out linking their products to slavery. And I'll kind of breeze through this, but we also have some really good tools now that we didn't have a few years ago, and they're getting better all the time, both in terms of regulations at the US level and regional, international level, but also in terms of some technological advances. Today we can put video technology on even small boats for just a few $100s. And in many cases, it's actually pretty effective in terms of providing the kind of service that observers can. And the last thing I mentioned, the Thai Union is starting to move. So far, most of the advances they made have been in Thailand, so improvements to how they deal with Thai vessels or Thai factories. But at least in principle, they've committed to address this through their entire supply chain. So we have some more work to do with them, but it's really good news. Summary, I'll probably skip through most of this. You can read, and a lot of people have already brought these up. But here are some of the specific examples. As Abby said, there's more on her website. Definitely want to see a ban on transshipment at sea, at least in problem fisheries like tuna. We want to see an increase in observer coverage. We have to stop letting companies force workers to pay to get jobs and end up in debt bondage and trapped on boats forever. Those are probably my highlights. So thanks, everybody. If you don't get a chance to ask me a question later and you want to, there are a couple of Greenpeace people here. I don't know if you want to stand up and say hello or something, but I see Bill over there. Felicity's in the back saying hello. Anyway, you can also ask them, especially if they're hard questions, find them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I would like to start off by asking each one of you a question, probably in reverse order, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. So, John, since you're just on the, on the bill, you're talking about progress by countries like Korea and Taiwan, and then you're talking about brands like Thai Union or StarKist, and I'm wondering where you're making more progress, through markets or policy?
It's a good question. Can you hear me okay? Is this? No.
Lean in.
How about now? No.
I think it's on. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to just talk right into it. No? Yes? So, all right,
Yeah.
so.
Be Greenpeace.
Right. Have we had more success with governments or corporations? I think we have to work on both pathways at the same time. But so far, we are seeing more progress faster on the market side. Ultimately, they're going to go together. We need regulations to even the playing field and to help deal with some of the companies that are not very interested in doing what they should. I'd say the really positive culture shift that is happening is that supermarkets and other companies that are involved in seafood are now starting to acknowledge that they have a responsibility for what they sell to you. That seems like a really obvious thing, but it hasn't been the case. We've seen supermarkets 5, 6, 7 years ago say, yes, okay, if we're selling seafood if we're selling fresh seafood, then we have some responsibility for how that was caught. But they didn't believe that they had any responsibility for something like a can of chicken of the sea tuna. That's chicken of the sea's problem. Well, no, I don't think that most customers see it that way. If they buy it from Walmart, then Walmart needs to be at least somewhat responsible. And so now we're seeing that change, and that's very exciting, promising.
Thanks. So we are in the law school, so sticking with this policy side of things. Abby, you mentioned that more than 50 countries have slavery in their seafood supply chain, and it's not just Thailand. Which countries would you say or governments are most active on the issue, and what's worked so far with them?
Well, Indonesia is really highlighted as being kind of a bright spot right now, and most of that is because they have tamped down on the level of illegal fishing that's happening in their waters. They're really trying to verify what boats are fishing in their waters, and to make sure they're getting some kind of oversight. it's not clear to me yet that that really involves a lot of labor inspections. And I think that one area that all countries, including the United States, could do a lot better on is ensuring that when vessels are inspected, either at port or at sea inspections, that those include labor inspectors as well, and people who are trained to identify human trafficking and forced labor.
Ian, sticking with the government theme, Daniel had mentioned Obama closing the loop for the Hawaiian long lines, and you didn't necessarily get into that issue. I don't know if you want to touch on it, especially since we're in the last week of the Obama presidency.
So just to clarify, it's not just for Hawaiian long lines. So the loophole was one that had long been open and allowed for the slavery issue to be sort of ignored entirely. And there's some problems with the closing of it, but it was a huge step forward. I do think the bigger place to focus on now, though, is to some degree what Abby said, which is there's this amazing push. If you think of historically supply chain accountability moments, you think of fair trade coffee, blood diamonds, sweat-free garments. These are all sort of buzz terms that most people know about, and these were moments when individual supply chains producing a specific type of product that we all consume got a lot of attention, Nike shoes. I think seafood is having its moment. It has been coming for a while. It started with dolphin-free tuna, which was a very green, kind of marine-focused moment. But now in the last 2-3 years, largely because of the other panelists and the work they've done, I think the labor issue now is being rammed into it, and the U.S. government has this seafood traceability plan. The big question, though, is whether when they devise the checklist of things that the port inspector, I think of a guy at the port with a clipboard, quite literally, and he or she has to check a bunch of things with regard to that ton of tilapia that's coming onto U.S. soil, whether that checklist has just questions about the net type, the kind of location of the ship, all those things, and no mention of crew manifest, wages, legally documented, these sorts of questions. That right now is being decided by the U.S. government, and unless there's a clamor, I think, from the public and rooms like this, I think the labor stuff is going to get left off that clipboard. So I think that's really the front that needs to be fought.
Thanks. Daniel, you're the wisest person on this panel, right? And you're very good at big picture stuff. So where do you see this issue going, or where might it spread to, even if we take care of it in the States? Maybe where is it already but isn't getting attention? Are there any issues we should have on the horizon?
Well, the U.S. is in an odd situation. The management of the U.S. fisheries is actually one of the best in the world. There is rebuilding. There is a Stephen-Magnuson Act that forces the government to rebuild stocks that have been overfished, at least using a 1980 baseline. So that is not the case in most other countries of the world, and this is a shining example. Also, NOAA is the agency in charge of regulating fisheries is very open and very responsive when people ask for data also. On the other hand, the US has gotten itself in a situation where it imports 80-90% of the fish that it gets. And that is where the shoe hurts, because in these other places, the sky is the limit. And all my panelists have noticed this nexus of when the resource go down, you have, if you want to continue to eat cheap fish, you have to reduce the cost. And you get a signal. Actually, this is a gigantic market failure. You get a clear signal from the resource itself, if I may use the word, from the signal. It tells you, I'm overfished, leave me alone. And the subsidies and the use of labor, forced labor and stuff, allows you to ignore the signal that you get from the resource and to close your ears. And you can continue to fish if you have subsidies or if you have prices that allow the overfishing to continue. And so this propaganda, this pro-fish propaganda, has generated in the US a huge demand for fish that is met by other countries. That is the same thing in Europe, that's the same thing in East Asia. And where is this fish coming from, actually? It's coming from West Africa, it's coming from the South Pacific, it's coming from South America. Essentially, it's these developing countries that are feeding the rich world. And that is a situation that it poses a big equity question. This is not only the workers that are exploited, it's the entire ecosystem, the entire hemisphere that is bled white. So this cannot go on, and it's going to break somewhere, and I don't know where. Perhaps the public is fed up with this notion of you cannot eat the fish without being participating in a crime. Imagine if we had this is in other sectors. If every TV you buy, or every iPad or a pod or whatever you buy, you would have to suspect that it has been stolen. It's fallen for a truck. You would have to check that every shop that sells you groceries has not stolen these groceries somewhere. This would be hell on earth. We have to be able to trust our institution that things are not done illegally. So basically, I'm saying the US and Europe have, and maybe Japan, have to export sustainability. They have to export good laws and impose this standard not only in their own country, but act as good citizens of the world, because it's a global problem.
Thank you. So we now like to open up the floor to Q&A. There are 2 mics down front. For anyone who has a question, please feel free to ask.
I guess this would open up with Ms. McGill, but maybe the others would jump in on it. The U.S. is a signatory to very few of the International Labor Organization accords. That's our labor standards. Plus, we have, as probably everybody knows, we've had a series of administrations pushing so-called trade agreements with investor-state dispute systems in it, which The Economist, hardly a pinko publication, has said should be trashed. That was in the recent CETA agreement with Canada. It's in TPP if it comes up in it. So we have a legal setting that does not work well for labor or for the environment. So I'm wondering, what is it that we need to get out there? Where should we be pushing on this?
Where should we pushing the U.S. government?
Well,
on this?
the U.S. government. Plus, of course, as you noted, that we're not, a member of a signatory of the law of the sea that several of you said, even though Clinton as secretary tried to push it, and Obama has a number of times as president attempted to push it, the Congress doesn't want it.
Yeah, so, not acceding to ILO conventions is a big problem in the United States. In particular, for the subject that we're talking about, there is a convention, 188, on work and fishing that has very clear guidelines of how fishermen should be treated. I think that the United States is to be lauded for joining onto the Port State Measures Agreement, which is something that I believe, John? Anyway, that's a point of progress, but as many of the panelists have already noted, by joining on to that, we aren't really looking at the labor side, we're mostly looking at the seafood side. When it comes to labor, though, one thing that I didn't mention is that seafood is actually one of the least union dense sectors in the world. It has way less than 1% union density. And I think that, some of that is government's fault, but a lot of it is also the union movement's fault. It's been an ignored sector for a long time. I think that that is also starting to change. So the International Union of Food Workers and the International Transport Workers Federation is pairing up to do a big push to organize fishers. So I think that as much as governments can not set up legal constructs that prohibit workers from organizing into unions, that would be very good. As much as the United States can use whatever levers it has to ensure that governments respect union rights for seafood workers that are trying to organize, that would be a good thing. And I'm just my final point on this, I'll call out the United States for its migrant labor practices. There's an organization called the National Guest Workers Alliance that has documented forced labor in Louisiana crab picking facilities, as well as on the East Coast and the Boston seafood facilities, because we treat our migrant workers horribly in this country. So I think that cleaning up our own house in order to ensure that we aren't allowing migrant workers in this country to be victims of forced labor is another great place to start.
Thank you. Can I throw in one thing before we move? So I would just also add that Uncle Sam, the U.S. government, is a big buyer. So not only is Uncle Sam a sort of bouncer at the door between the external, sort of foreign importers and the American consumer, and as that bouncer can say, hey, look, we're not letting those products in unless you can, provide this measure of traceability. That's one route. The other route is Uncle Sam itself, be it the USDA and the school lunch program, for example. A lot of tuna goes to public schools or the Department of Defense. A lot of tuna sold on military bases, not to beat up on tuna, but so if the US government wanted to lead by example, one way they could do it was just through its own purchasing policies and say, okay, we can't bounce at the door because we're going to get hit with this lobby and that, but what we can do is say, DOD and USDA, you can't, buy that stuff unless it meets this criteria, and we're going to sort of lead the world by example by having a really high bar as a consumer, as an institutional consumer, and then the model that creates would then conceivably be mimicked in the best of worlds by other large institutional buyers, some of them grocers and such. Sorry to jump in.
Hi, my name is Leah Kurtz, and I'm a grad student at the NYU Food Studies program. And so in addition to, first, thank you all for coming. This has been a great talk. And so in addition to the necessary legislative and policy changes that you've been talking about, as Abby said, I think there's this onus on the consumer because we do take part in this system. So my question is more about consumption. And so I wrote it down. So given the multiple layers of exploitation embedded in the fishing industry that impact overfishing, the slaughter of intended prey, and inevitable bycatch, the labor rights and basic human rights violations of workers, and the environmental health of the sea, is any consumption at this point not overconsumption? And if not, what kind of fish do each of the panelists eat and would recommend consumers eat? Thank you.
Daniel, we'll start with you.
So it is a horrible problem, and this alludes to exactly the thing that I was mentioning before. If you couldn't buy anything without having to fear that it is, it's one industry that is criminal, whereas the other industries are not so criminal, right? And so we hope that we can clean up this industry before we cannot eat anything. And specifically what the fish I eat is the one that my wife prepares. She's here. So I'm actually not giving you the answer. We live in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and is marvelous salmon that is actually wild. Wild salmon, you know that? You can't get it in New York, but in BC we get wild salmon, and this grilled wild salmon I really recommend it. But I don't like the fact that half of the salmon that are caught in BC are caught on quota that belongs to the man who owns half of BC. That is another problem, one of equity, that we'll have to also address one of these days.
I'm ducking this question. Yeah, I don't feel comfortable, with my own. I'm a vegetarian, but I don't, kind of claim to proselytize my own habits to others. I do also get a little nervous about that kind of line of thinking, just because much of the world depends on its protein, for its protein on these sources. So, but I think the gist of your question I get, and I think is important, which is, shouldn't we all be considering our own consumption habits? And yes, I think the big problem here is that we as consumers, individual or institutional, are blind to a large degree. And that doesn't let us off the hook. But until we're better equipped at knowing, like Dr. Pauly was saying, if tomorrow you wanted to go and find out which fish to buy, you might look at their websites and you could get a start, but you'd still be pretty blind as to the answer, because there's not real enforced traceability on the supply chain, and that's what we got to fix first.
Yeah, I'm also going to duck the what kind of fish question, because that I always ask John those things anyway. The only thing that I will say is that I don't think that right now any of the seafood certifications adequately assess labor to be trusted as to what to purchase from that particular standpoint. But we also don't advocate boycotts very often. The very last thing that our partners in Thailand want is for all people to stop eating Thai shrimp, because then they just get pushed into lumber or electronics or garments, which, is, just another exploitative industry. So the only time that I tend to not purchase seafood is if the workers themselves have called for a boycott. And the only one that I know of right now off the top of my head is Phillips Seafood from Indonesia, Phillips Crab from Indonesia. So I don't buy that.
I'll start with the easy one. Personally, I haven't eaten seafood in 30 years. That said,
You're old.
I know, I am old. People on my team are there's a former commercial fisherman, and he was a fisherman in Alaska and on the West Coast for 20 years. He stopped doing that partly because he didn't want to catch the last fish. He wants to be able to keep eating them. So he's been with Greenpeace and other environmental organizations for the last 20 years. Like Ian said, there's a lot of people in this world that are struggling to get protein, and seafood today is a really important part of that answer for well over 1 billion people. So I think that is going to continue, and we shouldn't try to stop that for a while. What we should do is try to make our fish stocks more healthy, our fisheries more sustainable, and ultimately we'll get to a point where they can feed more people. Probably not a lot more people. I mean, as Daniel's done a lot of work on this, even with more effort, we're not catching more fish anymore.
So I guess I'll just wrap that question up to just say that I think the term seafood is even problematic, the way that we're talking about it, because these are marine animals, and we had a nice panel in the spring on seeing seafood as animals, and I think it's much better to see this as sort of bushmeat and a bushmeat issue, where can we actually have a globalized market for bushmeat? If we tried to consider that for sort of primates in Africa, it would instinctually be built in that we would say, oh, that's not sustainable. And I think that is the issue that we have when we have expanding fisheries into Antarctica, looking at krill fisheries to feed pets, basically, or to feed farm salmon. I think we have to, wonder what we're up to. So I mean, my own preferences I don't think matter. It'd make a dent. I could do whatever. But I think that, like Ian, that the focusing on the consumer side of things too much can lead us down the wrong path, even though it's true that we're all complicit in some way in all of this. And so I think we do share that burden and obligation to help solve the problem.
You're welcome. And just to add one more thing, it's incredibly complicated as a consumer walking into a restaurant or a supermarket trying to buy sustainable, ethical seafood. It's brutal. As you mentioned, the traceability is not there. Complications like lack of observer coverage and transshipment, even when they're trying, they're probably not doing a very good job. We put the responsibility not on individuals, even though obviously the more informed you are, the better choices you're going to be able to make. But if they're going to sell you seafood, it's got to be sustainable and ethical. So we demand that from retailers.
Thank you all.
Hello. Two stories about the ocean that have come to my attention in the last month are this story, which was news to me, and another one about plastics and pollution. Somebody made a quip, there'll be more plastic than fish by 2050. And I was trying to process what that sentence means. Does it imply the ocean will just have lots of plastic and that's a mess? Or is there a connection to the fisheries? And where does that problem rate? Is that on the radar or?
I can take it. So the quip is actually justified. There is a group of people who work on this plastic problem. They have made a cruise from San Diego, I think, in California somewhere, to Hawaii with a plankton net, and they caught more plastic than fish. Also, every fish that they caught had in it plastic pellets in its stomach. So this this is the case that it can be made in certain areas that there already is more plastic than fish. Besides, the fish is declining and the plastic is increasing, so it's going to be, if it's not true yet, it's going to be. It actually began with the plastic plague, began with abandoned fishing equipment, the buoy, the floats, and so on. And it began really with our request or our demands for biodegradable plastics, because a buoy or a float that's abandoned is about that big, like a football, and floats, and it's ugly. So we said, these things have to be made out of biodegradable plastic. And so they degrade in what? In thousands of pieces of plastics. And we want to see this out of the way. Then they degrade in millions of pieces of plastic. But actually, when they are tiny little piece of plastics, they become even more dangerous, because this plastics is lipophile. It attracts oil-soluble substance. And so they become coated with the dioxin, the PCB, and the other persistent organic pollutants that are in the sea. And these pills, these poison pills, are consumed by fish that can be consumed by tuna and poison people. That is a real problem that a few years ago I would have said, oh, pollution is a problem of inshore water. But actually this is now getting to be a major problem. And you can see that it is a problem because we cannot even apprehend it. You read Popular Mechanics or other stupid magazine, they propose a mechanism to collect that stuff, like a garbage collection on the ocean. But the problem is actually the production of these plastic bags and plastic nonsense that we put in the rivers and everywhere in our trash, which end up in the sea. So the plastic is a bomb going to detonate in a few decades if it is not doing that now, along with global warming. And this is a major issue that the world has not begun to tackle. There are 5 major gyres in each ocean, 2 in the Atlantic, 2 in the Pacific, and 1 in the Indian. That's 5, yeah. And they are getting more and more concentrated and richer, and it's really a big issue.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bill Hewitt. I'm a writer and I teach at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. I'm wondering, and I've been a vegetarian and haven't had seafood for 45 years. Wow. Not pulling rank, I'm much older than you. But I'm wondering if seafood is not the problem, and stipulating certainly that there are protein needs which need to be met for at least 700 million people in the world and probably more in coming years. And seafood certainly can be and certainly has been a vital resource. But I'm wondering if globalized supply chains isn't the real underlying problem. And can we not certainly meet food security needs for the 700 million plus people who are undernourished and cut off these supply chains? It seems to me that in a certain way we're enabling this by saying, oh, let's make it certifiable. Let's work with governments on the ILO and the IMO and whomever else. But if we just sourced our food, regionally, then maybe these problems would go away, and reasonably quickly.
Yes.
Well, I'll say yes with an asterisk, right? So like, if you follow that line of thinking, then nobody in this room could ever have chocolate, period. Because we don't grow cocoa in this country. So if that's a sacrifice that you're willing to make, then, more power to you. That's not one that I personally am willing to make.
I draw the line at chocolate.
I draw the line at chocolate. But going back to what I said earlier, our partners also don't want that. The income that the cocoa farmers get in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire is the sole source of income for a lot of these communities. And I think that the problem is not that we have a globalized system of food trade, it's where the power in that system lies. The problem isn't that cocoa farmers in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire are producing cocoa for the US market. The problem is that there's 4.5 million cocoa farmers and there's 6 multinational companies that purchase it. And the balance of power is just completely stacked against them so that they will never, ever, ever, ever receive a fair price for their commodity under the current conditions. So I think that we need to start to flip that balance of power so that the producers of goods are once again setting the prices for the global market rather than the consumers.
But I think that the question is actually a very good one for the reason that the slow fish movement that emerged in Italy is trying to address, which is to eat fish that is locally produced, like locavore, you call this. The attempts by the US to rebuild its stocks, its fish, what does it amount to? Build up the biomass of these fish so that you can extract a bigger catch from them. I was trained in fishery science. This is all there is to fishery science. If you can rebuild the biomass, you can get a bigger catch. Now, since the 50s, since the post-war period, the fisheries operated under a different model. They extracted everything there was in a spot and then went on to the next one. They, like, how do you call this, clear-cut logging, and you move on to the next forest. If the mandate to rebuild is a different mandate, once you have rebuilt, you're supposed to operate sustainably. I'm very confident that the US, if they rebuilt all these stocks, could probably catch 30–40% more. And this is also true for Europe. It could probably double its catch. And it's true for Canada. It has one of the lousiest stock situation. And it has turned Canada from an exporter of fish to an importer, net importer. And it is because the stocks are way reduced. Think of the cod in New England. It is at about 2–3% of its historic stock size. If it were rebuilt, it could generate bigger catch as were observed 50 years ago. So if the developed countries of the world cease to depend so much on fish that they can import cheaply, and if they were almost forced by a movement that would be locally based, a slow food movement, a slow fish movement, then they would rebuild and consume the fish that is produced locally. And they would be perhaps a little bit less, but it would have lots fewer problems than presently, where essentially a few countries of the developed world drain all the fish in the world.
I would just add, you look at the carbon footprint. I mean, obviously there's no panacea, there's no silver bullet for all the problems. So what works for seafood may not work for cocoa. But buy local has a lot of logic to it, especially if you pivot out of labor and over to carbon footprint, and you look at sort of, hey, we might save this stock and replenish it, but acidification is going to knock it out anyway in 20 years because, climate change. So maybe buy local and not transporting so much of that fish from so far away makes sense in other categories. So there's a lot of merit, obviously.
Hi. This question is mostly for Jennifer and for John. In light of Jennifer's most recent or last book, Is Shame Necessary, and John's campaigns at Greenpeace, I'm wondering what role in alleviating these issues has shame played and also will continue to play in the future in terms of the producers, like these larger companies, but then also individual consumers. Like what can, even just pictures, like from what Ian has produced, what can that do? And then also what Daniel was saying about how eating fish, you can't really get away from the fact that you're sort of like implicit in this crime. So kind of more direct, really like powerful campaigns that are quite shaming, like Greenpeace, and then also less explicit techniques as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to duck this question, but I'm going to build on it for John, which is to say, Thai Union was already a little bit in hot water just due to its fishing practices. It's one of the biggest seafood companies in the world. What happened when Thai Union then gets singled out for the slavery issue? Like, does that bump up the shame factor for overfishing, or is it a completely different, group of campaigners or whatever?
Thanks, good question. I mean, shame plays a big part in how Greenpeace campaigns. We believe that companies, governments should be accountable for their actions. And one of the ways that we have applied that in this case has been through the Carting Away the Oceans reports that I was talking about before, where we were assessing retailers. And we sort of assumed that it would create some competition among the bottom rung of the scorecard, because who wants to be at the bottom of the Greenpeace scorecard? Is kind of a dangerous place to be. But we were surprised that there was at least as much competition at the top end. And it shows, yes, on one hand, shame can be brand damage. They invest enormous amount of money in promoting a brand, and that can be impacted through a shaming campaign. And it can cost them a lot of money. But another is that they have peers. The senior executives at these companies care what their peers think of them. And they have to answer to shareholders, but that kind of peer pressure really makes a difference too.
I think what we'll do now is just take the last two questions, both at the same time, and then we'll answer them and wrap up. Thanks.
Hi, my question's pretty quick, but I was just wondering if there's any labor or human rights issues that are specific to either the aquaculture or wild fishery industries, or if they're comparable, or what that difference is. Yeah,
thanks.
Hi, I've read somewhere that 90% of the big fish in the oceans have been already been fished out of the oceans. Is that an accurate statement today? And if that's so, what's the future of this industry, and more importantly, the people who work in the industry?
Thank you. So, Abby, do you want to start on the aquaculture versus wild caught, or?
Sure. So, I think that Ian gave a really good description of the kind of debt bondage that happens on fishing vessels. That same kind of debt bondage can happen in processing facilities. I'm not an expert on aquaculture, so I'm not that well equipped to answer that question. Maybe John knows a little bit more. I do know that in Bangladesh with farmed shrimp, there's a pretty big problem in terms of communities are forced in a very similar kind of debt bondage model that Ian talked about to collect shrimp fry, like the little baby shrimp, to supply to the farming industry. But that's an isolated case that I know of.
One other example where it's similar, so much of aquaculture that comes to the United States is based on carnivorous fish, like salmon. And so they get fed on wild fish, typically. And so you can have, in tuna fisheries, you can have human rights abuses on vessels specifically fishing for tuna. But with aquaculture, you can have outright slavery on boats that are catching feed to feed the shrimp or salmon.
It seems that there's also a gender difference in the sense that with wild caught, it's men only, whereas with aquaculture and processing, it can be both genders. Is that accurate, or?
Yes, that's very accurate. And a lot of times in the processing facilities, it's women actually who are doing the work in a lot of these places.
Ian, do you want to add to that? Or?
No. I mean, I was going to jump on the 90%, but I think maybe they're better. I think maybe that's best.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm afraid to jump on it because I may get it wrong among the experts, but I'm pretty sure that indeed, and having been tutored by these folks, the 90% number is correct with regard to the large fish, not if I'm on solid ground. And then what does the future hold, is too big a question, I fear, to answer. So I'm going to duck that one. But yes, on the aquaculture front, I do think the sort of, maybe this is related, I'll say it anyway. I do think one of the sectors in society that's really gotten a pass is the livestock feed sector, big agro. Huge amount of the fish getting consumed is not by us in this room. It's by chickens and pigs, and to some degree cats and dogs, but really it's livestock, and it's protein pellets. And there's this interesting economic race between soy and protein pellets, and depending on the price of soy, everyone will switch over to fish meal. And oddly, with all the amazing reporting by other venues, AP, Guardian, others, and the big agro has kind of, partially because they're not a brand conscious industry, who knows a big agro company, and how do you get at them? Maybe you, other than this guy, who among the non-tenured, so I think that's actually a worthwhile target for consumers to think about is there a way from an organizing perspective to get at the big consumers of fish meal?
So if I may, the 90% number for big fish, I think it's not an exaggeration. And in most fishing grounds, big fish have completely disappeared. The kind of fish that Hemingway wrote about. I would like to tell you a story that happened to me in '75, the first time I was in Indonesia. I had just finished my master, and I went along the coast of Indonesia, and there was a man fishing larvae of milkfish that are farmed with a spoon and put them in half a coconut that for raising. And he made a part of the sea calm through a rope. He had about a meter of rope, a big rope that floated and made a little calm area. And I spoke very little Indonesian. I asked him how much he made, and he told me about the equivalent of 10 cents a day. And I say, it's not much. And he said, no, especially because I have to give half of the money to the owner of the rope. And this is a true story. And in '95, this was in '75, and I was there to help a German project introduce trawling into the Java Sea. where there were 100,000s of fishers along the coast, the Java Sea coast, fishing with a stupid rope and a spoon. That is fisheries development for you. You will remember the rope story.
I think we'll remember a lot from tonight. So I would like to wrap up by thanking you all so very much and saying that although you said that you ducked many questions, you didn't. You took very difficult questions and gave really concise answers. And we welcome your questions afterwards. You can come up to all of us. And so my job is to end the panel now with gratitude. Thank you very much.